Our chief guest this evening, the Honorable Mr. Justice Rohinton Falli Nariman, in addition to being the judge of the Supreme Court of India, is also a distinguished scholar, great orator, linguist, comparative religious expert, and priest. I would request Honorable Mr. Justice Rohinton Falli Nariman to kindly come on stage and deliver the 7th Dr. L.M. Singhvi Memorial Lecture on Reincarnation, Comparative Religious Practices. Welcome, sir.
Shri Gopal Krishna Gandhi, Kamlaji, Manu, brother and sister judges, the Attorney General for India, other dignitaries, ladies and gentlemen. The 4th and 5th centuries BC are renowned for having produced 6 philosophers of the highest rank. 2 were from Greece, 2 were from this country, and 2 were from China. Out of the 6, 4 expounded upon reincarnation. The 2 Chinese gentlemen did not. Now, first, the Greeks. Pythagoras, to me as a school student, was taught only because of his theorem. And if I remember right, the theorem said that a 90-degree angle in geometry, if you total up its square, would be the equivalent of the square of the hypotenuse, which is the long side. I had not the least idea that he was a philosopher of the highest rank. It's only later that I came to know that he was vegetarian. And he believed strongly in reincarnation because there's a famous story told of him stopping somebody from kicking a puppy and saying, "I recognize in that puppy my dead friend." Now, Pythagoras, therefore, was of the school of thought that reincarnation took place not merely among humans, but also among animals and plants. And therefore, he preached the wider doctrine of transmigration. And according to him, therefore, this wheel of transmigration, being eternal, was something that one could at best only get out of. The other great Greek philosopher, Plato, mooted reincarnation in 2 of his books. One is The Republic, in which he spoke of a man called Er. Now, went into a trance and left his body for 12 days and came back and then described the various heavens, hells, and purgatory that he had been to. This, of course, formed the basis for Dante's Divine Comedy many, many centuries later. The difference being that Dante, the author himself, was taken down to hell and purgatory by Virgil, the poet, and taken up to heaven by his concept of the perfect woman, Beatrice. But there the analogy ends, because according to Plato's Republic, when came back and said that I have visited these heavens, hells, described them, said they are only temporary and transitional. Ultimately, one reincarnates after having been to heaven and hell. And one has to be very careful as to the next life that one chooses, because the choice is with one. You may choose wrongly in the sense of, you may be a person who may love power, and you may therefore choose to be a dictator in the next life, not knowing that most dictators land up at the gibbet. Now, apart from the Republic, in the Phaedo, which is another great diatribe between Glaucon and another philosopher, there again reincarnation is mooted, but this time the doctrine of karma enters. And what does the doctrine of karma, according to Plato, say? As you sow, so shall you reap morally. You must go up the moral ladder, not down the moral ladder. And therefore, in the Phaedo at least, reincarnation was mooted as being policed by the law of karma. The 2 great Indian philosophers will come to, because we'll have to deal with them in some detail. Mahavir and the Buddha. But the two Chinese philosophers, that is Confucius and Lao Tzu, didn't speak of reincarnation at all. In fact, Confucius spoke of ancestor worship and the being of a superior, what he called a superior man, superior only because he was virtuous and not otherwise. Lao Tzu preached the Tao, which is that you must be passive in all things like nature. And his most famous simile was that look at water and look at the hardest rock. Over centuries, what does water do to that rock? And therefore, he said, you must accept what there is. And in this acceptance, you really follow what he called the true path, the Tao. But we don't have too much time for these digressions, and we must come back onto the path that we have chosen for this evening. The other old religions, the Egyptian religion, the Shinto religion, don't say much about reincarnation. My old faith, the Zoroastrian religion, which is perhaps the first monotheistic religion on earth, also doesn't say much, except that in chapter 29 of the Yajashni, there is the soul of the cow, exactly like chapter 10 of the Bhagavad Puran, which wails and says that, look, there is rapine, there is plunder, there is hell on earth. For God's sake, send us a savior. And there is a conference which takes place in heaven between God and the archangels. And finally, they say that Zarathustra is one such person who has proved his worth. And we are going to therefore send him. Now, if he has proved his worth, it must have been in a past life. So that's about all that we get about reincarnation. Otherwise, we get nothing. On the contrary, the doctrine preached by Zarathustra has no place for reincarnation because it says that you come here for the first time. When you die, you either go into a heaven which is my kind of heaven, which is an abode of song, music, or you go into a hell which is reformatory in nature. You are actually sort of played a video playback of your entire life when you die. And you see where you have gone wrong. And therefore, attempt to choose aright in the next existence. And this goes on until finally there is a cutoff point, a judgment day, and which is called an All Souls Day, so to speak. After which, all souls then get resurrected. That is, they become immortal, now being whole or perfect or being able to coexist perfectly with everybody else, back on earth. So you have this model, which is the Zoroastrian model, which is largely followed in one of the Judaic sects, because the Jews also had some very shadowy notion of the afterlife, which they called Sheol. And it is only after King Cyrus freed them from Babylon and gave them funds to rebuild their temple, of which the Wailing Wall is a part. You will notice the Wailing Wall is in two parts. The lower part was built out of Persian funds from the Persian treasury in King Darius' time. They ruled over Judea for about 250 years and obviously influenced their religious thought. So that now you had Jews who were called Pharisees and Sadducees. Sadducees being persons who were the old Jews, who said that we don't believe in any resurrection. And Pharisees being persons who took on the Zoroastrian idea of heaven, hell, and then a judgment day and a resurrection. You have a pretty similar picture so far as Christianity and Islam is concerned. So that ultimately you have the three great faiths which permeate India, which really moot reincarnation. The first is the Jain faith. Now, Jainism does not begin with Mahavir. In fact, Mahavir is only the 24th Tirthankar. A Tirthankar is a person who has crossed the ford, so to speak. What he has done is to achieve nirvana in the sense, and this is also interesting, that he has gone back to the original state of his jiv or soul. Now pause here for a minute. According to the Jains, there are 6 dravyas or substances 1 being animate and 5 being inanimate. The animate one is Jeev. And there are any number of Jeevs floating around in the universe, innumerable number. Incidentally, there is no God. It is very important to remember that the Jain religion is an atheistic religion. It gives you reasons why God does not exist. Now, it is this atheistic faith which first moots transmigration, reincarnation, and the doctrine of karma. Now, these 6 dravyas are eternal. They have always existed, will always exist. It's their permute and combine in the form of human beings, animals, plants, etc., that is spoken of, in which reincarnation takes place. Now, as I told you, the first dravya is Jeev, which are these innumerable animate souls, all of whom have consciousness and perception, 2 things. The others are Pudgal, which is matter, then dharma and adharma, not in the sense we understand it. Dharma is that which permits motion. For example, water is dharma in which a fish can travel. Adharma is the exact opposite, which brings it back to rest. And finally, space and time in which all this takes place. So, what is interesting in Jainism is, you have no God, you have any number of disembodied souls which are floating around, which when they come into contact with Pudgal, within the space-time framework, then produce either humans, animals, or plants. Now, compatible with the fact that there is no God, there is no plan, there is no nothing, you have this massive wheel, and time in Jainism is not linear, it is cyclical. So you have this wheel through which you transmigrate. And the law which operates the wheel is the law of karma. It takes you some 84 lakh lives, according to the Jain scriptures, because there are 84 lakh plants, animals, etc., before you reach human status. And once you reach human status, like a game of snakes and ladders, if you do not climb up the moral ladder and you do something wrong, down you slip again. And what is interesting is then you climb it again. And this goes on and goes on and goes on without end. So the importance of Jainism in giving us this doctrine, not only for the first time, but giving it to us, and it's actually borrowed from Jainism, and goes into Buddhism and Hinduism, is that you must remember it is first part of an atheistic faith. No plan, no God. There are these Jeevs. Everything has a Jeev. Incidentally, even a watercourse has a Jeev. So you have transmigration of the highest order. You can go up from a watercourse to being an amoeba, to being an algae, to being larger forms and better forms of plant and then animal life and then human life. So the ultimate in Jainism is to follow what they call their 5-fold path. And that you can follow only when you are human. And that path is that you must first follow the doctrine of ahimsa, most important, which is non-violence to every single thing on earth, not merely living or animate. Second, aparigraha, which is equally important, which is that you give up attachment, desire, because desire produces the problems that we all have. The third, astaya, no stealing. The fourth, brahmachari, which is celibacy. And the fifth and most important, living by satya, which is truth. Now, it is only when you follow each one of these things strictly that ultimately you can become a jinn, like Rishabdev, the very first Tirthankar, who was really a king. And it is his son Bharat who has given the name Bharat to this country. God alone knows when he lived in hoary antiquity. But he is the very first who has apparently broken through. And broken through in the sense that he has stopped, so far as his soul is concerned, this transmigration up and down, in snakes and ladders, if I may put it that way. And finally, seen to it that his Jeev, which is his own soul, gets back to its pristine, eternal, and all blissful form. Jainism, again, has no intermediate between a person dying and the next life or the next incarnation, so to speak. So there's an immediate entry into either the womb of a human being or as a seed for a plant or as water in a watercourse, etc. And this is dictated by the inexorable law of karma. It is inexorable, there is no way out. As you sow, so shall you reap in your human status. When you come to Buddhism, you have a completely different view of reincarnation. The first important thing about Buddhism is that the Buddha refused to believe in a soul. He gave what is called a very famous speech on the doctrine of anatta. Now, anatta means there is no soul. Unlike Jainism, where you have these 6 dravyas which are eternal and which keep changing when they manifest themselves in human beings, plants, and animals. According to the Buddha, there is nothing eternal. Everything is in a state of flux. So that you have 5 skandhas which all come together at random. One of them being consciousness, which comes very close to a soul. Because according to the Jains, consciousness is one attribute of a soul. So, you have these 5 skandhas which come together at random, produce human beings, animals, plants again at random, and disperse at random. Now, what is interesting is, again, it is the law of karma which is now spoken of, but in a slightly different form. Karma here is spoken of as being past and present, and they make a distinction between the two. They say, so far as your past karma is concerned, you have worked it out. That part is over. What you are doing just now is producing karma, which will see where you will fit in the afterlife. Another important thing is that karma is now broken down into intent, because the effect of karma now depends on not merely the action, but first on the intent. Second, whether the act is in fact carried out. And third, and very, very importantly also, whether at any point, having carried out that act, you have later repented. Now, all these things go into the till, so far as karma is concerned, in Buddhism. And therefore, it is only when you ultimately disperse at random, at death, that your karma accounts are taken, so to speak, your balance sheet is drawn up. And you have good versus bad, including the effect of whether you have actually intended the act, number one. You may have performed an act without intending it. You may have intended an act without performing it. And above all, ultimately, you may be a person who may be genuinely sorry for what he has done, in which case you can reverse it. All these little minor details are very interesting because ultimately, when you speak of reincarnation and anatta, the two do not seem to go together. Because if you have no soul, then what reincarnates? Therefore, you have a distinction in Mahayan and Theravada Buddhism. Mahayan says, what reincarnates is consciousness, which is one skandha. In Theravada, what reincarnates is another type of skandha, which is heredity, interestingly enough. Because heredity you will find missing in both the Hindu schools of karma as well as the Jain schools. Heredity comes in only in the Theravada school. So what migrates therefore, or transmigrates, is heredity and character, which are two other, so to speak, skandhas. When you come to Hinduism, you begin with the Rig Veda. The Rig Veda had no concept whatsoever of reincarnation. The Rig Veda was some speculative hymns which were over thousands of years by some 414 seers. And you have 10 mandalas or books which make very interesting reading. And the basic emphasis in the Rig Veda is on life, not on what happens after. And therefore, there's no developed concept of heaven at all. But there is some concept of heaven. And the Rig Veda speaks of three heavens. The heaven of Yama, who's the first man who ever went to the underworld, so to speak, which is the heaven of the moon, which is the lowest of the three heavens. Then you go to the heaven of the sun, where there are Savitar, Pushan, the other solar deities, all of whom are produced by Aditi, who is a daughter of Daksha, who in turn is a son of Brahma, the creator. And what is interesting is, Aditi and Daksha produce each other, so that the child can really be, in this case, the father of the man. And you have, after they produce each other, the 8 Adityas. Now, of these 8 Adityas, 7 are solar deities. The 8th is the dead egg, Martanda, which is mankind. Now, why is it the dead egg? Because it's the egg that was born and slated to die for the reason that Aditi did not offer a Pinda ball to the gods before creating Martanda. She created the other 7 after the requisite offering to the gods, as a result of which 7 Adityas were immortal, but the 8th was slated to come here and die, like us. Now, in the various chapters of Mandala 10, which is the most interesting, you have many speculative ideas of creation. Because the Rig Veda, as I told you, was more concerned about the creation of the universe, life in the universe, rather than what happens after death. So you have in hymn number 72, the concept of Brahmanaspati, who is somebody who stands as a god with a bellows and who blows life into mankind. You have the concept of Vishwakarma in chapters, hymns 81 and 82. And Vishwakarma is what? Vishwakarma is nothing other than a great architect who actually fashions the universe with his hammer, something like Thor in Greek mythology. Then you have the famous Purush Sukta in hymn number 90, where you have cosmic man, that is one of us, as the embodiment of the entire universe, 3/4 of which is outside the world, 1/4 of which is here. And you have the 4 varnas emanating from his head, from his shoulders, from his thighs, and from his feet. And so on and so forth. Then you have the concept of Hiranyagarbha, which is the great cosmic egg out of which each one of us has come, in hymn 121. And finally, in hymn 129, you have the concept of a Swayambhu. Now, Swayambhu is very interesting because it says that at that time, there was neither existence nor non-existence. And this thing breathed on its own. The first thing that happened was, with warmth came desire. And with desire came the desire to create. And Swayambhu therefore breathed on its own and ultimately created all of us. And then it ends on a very enigmatic note which says, perhaps the gods in heaven know from whence Swayambhu came, perhaps they know not. And that's where it ends. So the Rig Veda, as you can see, is more interested in theories of creation, theories of life, and why we are here, rather than how we come back or whether we come back at all. It belongs to the Vedant, which is the end of the Ved, which are called the Upanishads, to now have a full-blown theory of reincarnation. And for this, one needs to read basically 3. The Chandogya, the Brihad Aranyak, which is the oldest, and the Kausitaki. Now, each one of these basically tell us that there are 5 stations within which each one of us goes at death. And they are called the stations of Pitriyan, where our forefathers have gone. They are the earth station, they are the sun station, etc., atmosphere station, and finally you come back. But if you are fortunate enough to go by what they call the 2 ways, which is not the Pitriyan way, but the Devayan way, the way that the gods went, then you have an upward movement, and you continuously keep getting into realms of light, finally lightning, and beyond lightning, you reach perfect bliss. and you are out. You have achieved moksha, so to speak. Now, this is a very, very crude, if I may put it, summary of what they tell you. They tell you a lot else, but there's no time in which to go into it in further detail. This is now fleshed out by the Purans. Now, the Purans come much later. The Purans are roughly about 1500 years old. And in the Purans, you have the Garud Puran at the forefront, and one or two others, Agni, Brahman, etc. And they tell you the Brahminical importance now of ritual. So what they tell you is, it's very, very important when somebody dies to have his death ceremonies performed. Why? Because what you do here on earth in the form of a pinda, which is a ball, which is made of rice, ghee, milk, etc., is really the food that this soul will be eating in its next 10 days in the next world. And in the next world, it's like a rocket with 3 stages, with each stage falling off. So what is interesting is, the first stage is the Vayu stage, where it's called an aerial body, which is there for about 10 or 12 days. The aerial body then gets hogged up and dissipated. After that comes a Preta body, which is what is called a temporary body in which you move around here like a ghost or a spirit. And a story is told of somebody called Sudev, the Vaishya, who did not have these Pinda rituals performed, which is why he continues to travel around earth as a ghost even today. So it is enjoined upon you that you must have the Pinda ritual done, otherwise this is what is going to happen to you. Finally, you have what is called the experience body, the third rocket stage. Rocket stage 1 has gone, 2 has gone. Now number 3 comes in. And this experience body then makes you experience the joys of heaven and the woes of hell, depending again upon what you have done here. And after you exhaust what you have done in terms of the merit or demerit that you have done on earth, you then come back and are reincarnated, somewhat like Plato's Ur, if you remember. So that you have exhausted your merit, demerit in heaven, hell, and now you come back as a reincarnated being. And here again, like Jainism and Buddhism, you can be reincarnated as a plant, as an animal, not as a watercourse. But transmigration is the order of the day. Incidentally, none of these models have humans reincarnating only as humans. This is very interesting. In all of them, you have transmigration. Now, given these models, what is interesting is how does karma go hand in hand with predestination? Another very interesting subject on which many books have been written. Karma, again, can be divided into active and passive. And if you divide it into active and passive, passive karma is that which you have done in your past life and which is now done to you as a result. For example, you may be born a leper. That's because of what you did in your past life. But active karma is how you behave right now. And if you are a thief just now, it is because of your bad karma in your last life. And now you continue being a thief. And are therefore carrying out your punishment and in fact carrying out further bad karma for which you will be punished in future. So, you have what is called active and passive karma, therefore, which accounts for everything that is happening to you. What people are doing to you and what you are doing to yourself. Where does predestination fit? Nowhere. Which is why you have an intermediate model, which is the Adeshar or Adarbad Maraspan model in Zoroastrianism, which says that there are a few things which are preordained: life, wife, children, property, death. Whether you will attain moksha or salvation or etc. is all in your hands. So there's a neat division made between something with which you come and something which is patti in your hands. As opposed to this, of course, you have the Gosala, great preacher of the Ajivaka sect, which says everything is predestined. So you have various models again, but the karma model by and large tends to explain everything by saying that it is what you have done, basically, in terms of your bad deeds that leads to what people do to you now and what you do to yourself and where you will go later. So, given karma and predestination also, ultimately one comes to what are the plus points and what are the alternative models, if any. Obvious plus point of reincarnation is that it tends to explain suffering on earth. And if you remember, the Buddha begins with suffering, because the four noble truths in Buddhism are first that there is suffering. Second, why is there suffering? Because of desire. Third, what do we do to get out of this wheel of suffering? We curb and try and get rid of desire altogether. And four, how do we do it? We follow again the Eightfold Path, which is the moral path which is laid down by so many other faiths. In essence, good thoughts, good words, good deeds. Of course, here it is right action, right meditation, etc., etc. So, again, what is interesting is that ultimately, not only does it explain suffering, it also gives us a moral ladder to climb. Because you are told, whatever you do, as you sow, you will reap. So the other great plus point of reincarnation is it tells you better stay on the straight and narrow, because the moment you do something wrong, that wrong is going to come back and hit you like Newton's third law of motion. So you better be on the straight and narrow. Third, because of transmigration and because of the fact that you may well be a plant or an animal in your next life, you must be compassionate to every living being. This is the third great, if I may say so, plus point of this theory of reincarnation. And fourth, it tends to explain geniuses like Mozart, Shankaracharya, etc. Because it is only if you have achieved so much in your past lives that you can come as a 5-year-old and suddenly compose a full piano concerto, or at the age of 10, write some fantastic treatise on things which sadhus, etc., have not been able to do for hundreds of years. So, given these, let us see the alternative models now. One model you will find on the Buland Darwaza in Fatehpur Sikri, and is written in Persian. It says, and Akbar liked it so much that he had it put up there. And by the way, it's something that Jesus said, which is not in the Bible. He says, Jesus, peace upon him, said, "Do not build houses upon this earth, but build bridges to the next world. For this earth is but a moment. Spend it in prayer. The rest is unseen." This takes you back to the, if I may call it, resurrection model, which I spoke about earlier, which was there in Zoroastrianism, one part of Judaism, and then Christianity and Islam. The emphasis then is not like the Buddha on suffering here. The emphasis is that this earth is but a moment. It's a test period, and it will pass like a flash. What is really going to happen is what is important. So it's the next world that you focus upon, and the ultimate good news that at the end of time, that is when Judgment Day kicks in, all souls will finally be in a state of perfection, immortality, be completely happy, and be able to coexist peacefully with each other. So this model, therefore, as opposed to the karma or reincarnation model, is that don't count anything on earth as being permanent. It is just a very, very small transitory stage for you to move on further. The second model is the model of, if I may call it, younger Zoroastrianism, which is that you have an all-good God and an all-bad devil. So anything that is bad, you attribute to a devil. God has not done anything bad. It's the devil who does everything that is evil. And you must therefore actively fight on the side of God against the devil. Now, suffering, therefore, again gets explained in this model by saying, suffering is not God's handiwork. Suffering is the devil's handiwork. And you get rid of the devil, which is ultimately going to happen at the end of time, because God is omniscient, but the devil is not. And finally, when you are able to get rid of the devil, we will all be able to live peacefully and happily. That's one other alternative model. And the third alternative model you find in the book of Job, which is a fascinating book, which is book number 18 in the Old Testament. Now, Job is a person who is not a Jew. He comes from some other place. But he is a man who has a large number of wives, children, property in the form of cattle, etc., and is extremely happy and is living happily. Satan enters, incidentally, in the Bible for the first time in this book. And Satan here is under the control of God because he's a fallen angel. So Satan now takes the permission of God and says, look, this man appears to be extremely happy, he's so smug. Let's try him a little. So God says, all right, I give you permission to try him. So how does he try him? He destroys all his livestock. He takes away most of his wives, destroys his children. But Job is steadfast, and Job says, the Lord hath giveth, the Lord can take away. Finally, when 3 friends of his come, Eliphaz and 2 others, they speak to him and they say, and they give him this alternate theory that, look, all this is probably happening to you because of the sins in your past life, the reincarnation kind of theory. And finally, Job says, after he is afflicted with boils now by Satan, that all right, I still say that God is great, that God is good, but I question his justice. And therefore you have this great conundrum. Why is a good person like me suffering like this? And what's the answer? So I want an answer from God. Finally, a young man called Elihu comes and tells him, don't you realize God is great? God is far above all of us. And this suffering, take positively. If you take it positively, what does it mean? That God is trying you, you must pass the test, pass the trial. And in any case, he's purging you of evil. Ultimately, God answers. And God's answer is to deflect Job from his misery and show him the wonders of nature. Now, when he shows him the wonders of nature, finally Job says, oh, fabulous, and forgets his suffering, and ultimately comes to the theory that, look, all that we stress is suffering. Why don't we remember the good that is done to us? So this alternative model again is very interesting in that it says, everything is not suffering. We forget very easily the good that is done to us. And if ultimately you balance life out, life is very good. Nothing wrong with it. So given these alternative models now, let's go to some of the pitfalls of the doctrine. The first pitfall is that you are punished. And as a punishment, therefore, you come back as an animal, plant, etc. Or maybe as a deformed hunchback. You don't know why you are being punished. On the other hand, in the resurrection model, you remains exactly you in your onward journey, ultimately, onto judgment day and finally the resurrection. You remember everything you have done wrong here. But in reincarnation, you remember nothing. And that's why you have in the Purans this very interesting concept of an embryo inside a womb remembering all its past lives. But the moment it comes out, the Maya of Vishnu envelops it, as a result of which it forgets everything. You see? So this is one very major pitfall. You don't know why you are being judged and why you are suffering at the moment. Another very interesting pitfall is that it is totally Earth-centric. There are billions of planets in the universe. There may be billions of other life forms. In fact, I remember years and years ago, we used to get Newsweek magazine. And you had something called Lurie's Opinion. And Lurie's Opinion was a cartoon strip. And you had a Viking spacecraft land on Mars with 2 rocks facing each other. One rock telling the other, shh, don't sneeze, they might take us for rocks. See? So this again, therefore, shows that this doctrine is ostrich-like, Earth-centric. Nothing else other than the Earth exists, which is why you keep coming back here. Why can't you go elsewhere? The third and very major pitfall, again, logically speaking, is that there is no law of karma which attaches to an animal or a plant. If the law of karma is what fuels or propels persons in this round of transmigration, why does it ultimately convert a human into a plant, and then a plant into another form of plant, and maybe then another form of animal? Why? What is the law then? And what has that plant done or that animal done to then move on to being the next animal or plant? Another very interesting thing, Father Tertullian, one of the great church fathers, had said that suppose you have reincarnation only among human beings. There's no transmigration. The moment you have it only among human beings, again, you hit a blank wall. Because every generation, there are so many more souls which come into being. Now, if there are billions of souls which keep coming into being, where have all these souls come from? Everything has not in that sense, transferred from an earlier life to this life. If, for example, in the last generation you had 10,000 as an example, and today you have 1,00,000, how do you account for the other 90,000? So this is a problem so far as humans are concerned. But then the larger problem is when you have transmigration, because you don't know the law by which plants and animals move upwards or downwards. One other very important thing, there's an internal contradiction also. The contradiction is this: to be born as human is the best form. Now, I would much rather, speaking for myself, be born as a dog in a dog lover's household than be born as a human who's to suffer for the rest of his life. So therefore, what again does not seem to, the theories don't seem to account for the level of suffering in humanity or the animal creation or the plant creation. Equally, they don't distinguish between being born as a dog in a dog lover's home and a dog as a police or a guard dog who may be beaten all the time and may not be given enough food and may be chained for most of the time. So we have a lot of these problems which also creep in, apart from which law propels one up and down. Then, of course, we have the voice of experience, which speaks. Now, an interesting lady called Rosemary Brown was a pianist. And she was a medium, so that she said that the great composers could visit her when called. They continue on another plane of existence and they continue composing. So that she played some tune which Beethoven composed in the next plane of existence. Similarly, something that Schubert composed in the next plane. And she was no genius to be able to compose in Beethoven style, in Schubert style, in Liszt style. And that record is available for everybody to hear today. Now, if that is true, and if all these people who have died hundreds of years ago are continuing doing things on other planes of existence, they have not come back. And this is as opposed to various persons who say that, look, we will go back to a particular village, we recognize this particular home, I remember in that incarnation I did X and Y and so on. Now, there's a very interesting book by Paul Edwards, who attempts to debunk each one of these experiences, which a man called Ian Stevenson has meticulously set down. So, reading these two books again will give you a very interesting picture of whether reincarnation actually takes place in terms of real life experience or doesn't. One other major pitfall. The theory of evolution, for example, again tells you that you are moving forwards. You are never moving either sideways or backwards. So, when Darwin preached evolution, it was apes which became men. Men never became apes. Now, this again is fully incompatible with a snakes and ladders kind of thing, where if you are bad in this one life, you may slip all the way down and have to work yourself up again, by which law, nobody knows. One other important pitfall. You have a law. Who is the lawgiver? It's very difficult to conceive of a law without a lawmaker. In Jainism, there is no maker. There is no God. In Buddhism, equally, there is no God. It's only in Hinduism now that in the 6 schools of Hindu philosophy, it's in Vedanta that you have Brahman, who perhaps is the maker. But in the older schools, such as Sankhya, you don't have God again, atheistic school. In the yoga school, you have a full-blown concept of Ishwar, and therefore a God controlling. Now, if there is a God controlling, and if there is a God who is actually operating this law of karma, he is operating it extremely arbitrarily. Because if you are going to reach human life after so many million lives and suddenly slip down again, there is no plan, there is no nothing, there is just this circle out of which you have to go. Which is why you have these various concepts of nirvana. You've seen, Jainism has the concept where you get back to your eternal state. Buddhism has a concept of where you basically snuff out, just get out of this. Hinduism again has this concept of moksha and other concepts where in Vedanta you ultimately merge with the ultimate. Your Atman becomes Brahman. But finally, the bottom line really is this, that if one were to draw up some unified kind of theory, and we take these divergent strands of all the great religions together and put them together, what do we get? We get, first, as you sow, so shall you reap. That law is inexorable. Climbing up and down the moral ladder is therefore the means by which you attain the end. The end may be, as I pointed out just now, merger, nirvana, resurrection in the form of a human being on earth again. But that end is again the same, because the end ensures that death goes. You are now in an immortal state and you are in an all-happy state. So to end this lecture, we can end it with or on a note of hope by one other delightful quote from the Brihad Aranyak Upanishad, which is the most famous quote from that Upanishad, that ultimately, O Lord, lead us from falsehood to truth, lead us from darkness to light, and lead us from death to immortality. Thank you very much.